In the days following Pearl Harbor, war quickly engulfed the Pacific. The Japanese onslaught that began on December 7, 1941, didn't stop at Hawaii. It swept into Southeast Asia and the Philippines almost immediately. American forces in the Philippines, caught off guard by devastating airstrikes, faced an invasion with much of their air power and naval support knocked out. Submarines suddenly became some of the only U.S. assets capable of striking back. Just 3 days into the war, on December 10th, USS Sea Lion was fatally bombed in port at Cavite, becoming the first American submarine lost in World War II. It was a sobering omen of the challenges ahead. As American forces scrambled, another submarine, the aging USS S-36, SS-141, was about to enter the fray and make history as the second U.S. submarine lost in the conflict. USS S-36 was an S-class submarine launched in the early 1920s, one of the sugar boats that patrolled Asian waters. Nearly 2 decades old at the outbreak of war, S-36 and her sister subs were limited in range, speed, and diving depth compared to newer fleet boats. Yet they had proven their reliability in peacetime and produced many seasoned submariners. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, these boats were thrust to the front lines of a desperate defense. S-36's story, from her tense war patrols to a harrowing shipwreck and the crew's fight for survival, exemplifies the courage of America's submarine force in the opening months of the Pacific War. This is the story of S-36, the submarine that fell second. When news of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached the Philippines in the early hours of December 8, 1941, S-36 was already at sea. Just 5 days earlier, on December 3rd, her planned overhaul had been canceled. War loomed, and the old submarine was ordered back into action. Lieutenant John R. McKnight, Jr., her commanding officer, received orders to take up a defensive station off Cape Bolinao on Luzon's western coast and guard against Japanese landings. The crew worked around the clock to get the aging boat seaworthy. For the next several days, S-36 lay in wait in a hidden cove near Lingayen Gulf, maintaining vigil. On December 8th, Japan launched simultaneous attacks across the Pacific, and the submarine's crew received confirmation that hostilities had officially begun. On December 10th, Japanese bombers struck Cavite Navy Yard to the south, crippling the base and sinking USS Sea Lion, the first U.S. submarine lost in the war. S-36, cut off from Cavite after the radio fell silent, remained on station, alone and uncertain of the wider situation. Her crew stayed ready, even as the boat's systems began to falter. On December 12th, the electrical steering gear failed. By the 13th, exhaust leaks complicated diving. Attempts to contact headquarters were met with silence as communications across the Philippines broke down. Finally, on December 16th, S-36 received orders to return for repairs. She navigated toward Mariveles, the last American naval foothold on Luzon. She arrived on December 20th, just as American and Filipino forces were retreating into the Bataan Peninsula. Her patrol had yielded no confirmed sinkings, only a list of growing problems. But she and her crew had survived the opening wave of the Pacific War. In late December, the crew of S-36 worked feverishly to patch up their boat at Mariveles. The situation was grim. Japanese forces were advancing, and daily air raids kept everyone on edge. With only limited repairs possible in the field, she was ordered out again. On December 30th, 1941, S-36 embarked on her second war patrol, determined to strike back at the enemy as U.S. forces regrouped to the south. Once again, S-36 crept out of Manila Bay under the cover of night for what would become her final mission. In the first days of January 1942, S-36 prowled the waters of the Verde Island Passage between Luzon and Mindoro, hunting for Japanese ships. On January 1st, she sighted a small enemy transport docked at Calapan, on Mindoro Island and seized the opportunity. The submarine closed in and fired a single torpedo. The crew reported a hit and believed they had sunk the 5,000-ton vessel. Japanese records did not confirm a sinking. After the attack, S-36 remained on patrol for another week, weaving through islets and channels while evading enemy patrol craft, but age and hard use were catching up with the boat. On January 8th, her port air compressor broke down, complicating her ability to recharge air for diving. 2 days later, the starboard compressor began acting up. Still far from any safe harbor, S-36 pushed on, now aiming to leave Philippine waters and join Allied forces gathering in the Dutch East Indies. But on January 13th, more trouble struck when one of the boat's electric motors went out of commission. Engineers toiled to bring it back online, and by the next day the submarine was limping along once more in the Sulu Sea, stubbornly continuing patrol despite her worsening condition. By mid-January, the Allies were consolidating their remaining naval forces in the Dutch East Indies under a joint American-British-Dutch-Australian command. S-36 and a handful of other submarines were ordered to head south toward Java, both to reinforce the defense and to escape the noose tightening around the Philippines. Lieutenant McKnight set course through the Makassar Strait, aiming for the Dutch naval base at Surabaya. It would be a long and perilous voyage for a damaged submarine. On January 15, 1942, disaster nearly struck. S-36 experienced more engine trouble on the surface at dawn, delaying her dive in dangerous waters. As the crew labored to fix the issue, a shape appeared on the horizon. A Japanese destroyer closing fast. Caught in the open, S-36 crash-dived. With one main motor still shaky and the other sputtering, the submarine barely managed to submerge. The destroyer was quick to pounce. In moments, 7 depth charges exploded around the sub. Lights shattered and went out. Fuses blew. Water leaked through straining seals. The submarine's hull rang with the thuds of near misses as her crew was thrown into darkness. The sub sank to 150 feet before regaining partial control. When she finally leveled off, the situation was dire. Depth control was erratic, and one motor's bearing was overheating to the point of smoking. For the next 2 hours, S-36 played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the destroyer overhead. Her depth fluctuated wildly between 100 and 200 feet as the crew fought to prevent an uncontrolled descent. At one point, S-36 sank past 230 feet, forcing the blowing of her ballast tanks. With the trim pump stalled and water sloshing in the bilges, McKnight ordered life jackets and escape lungs distributed, preparing the crew for the possibility of surfacing and fighting it out with their lone 4-inch gun. It was a last-ditch scenario no submariner wanted to imagine, yet by skill and luck, the submarine survived. Her crew managed to jury-rig cooling to the overheating motor and stabilize the boat's buoyancy. After what must have felt like an eternity, the Japanese destroyer abandoned the hunt. S-36 was battered, but alive. She crept onward down the Makassar Strait, but the damage from the depth charges compounded her already fragile condition. One crewman had collapsed from heat and fumes, and the interior of the sub reeked of smoke, sweat, and diesel. Still, they pressed on. But unbeknownst to the crew, an even greater ordeal lay ahead. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 20, 1942, S-36 was feeling her way through the Makassar Strait, roughly 60 miles off the coast of Celebes. The night was moonless, the seas choppy, and visibility poor. Strong currents pushed and pulled at the submarine as she crept forward on her dangerous course. Below deck, the crew struggled with inaccurate Dutch charts, relying on dead reckoning. Unbeknownst to them, a coral reef lay ahead in the darkness. Just after 4 a.m., S-36 slammed onto Taka Bakang Reef. The boat shuddered to a violent halt as her hull grounded on the coral. In an instant, the valiant little submarine was fatally stranded. The crew rushed to assess the damage. The submarine had run so far up onto the reef that, at low tide, she sat perched above the waves. Water began seeping into the forward compartments, and soon the battery well flooded. Salt water mixed with battery acid to produce deadly chlorine gas, and sailors coughed as the greenish-yellow fumes spread. They vented what they could and donned emergency breathing gear. For the next 24 hours, the crew threw everything they had into saving their stricken ship. Ballast tanks were blown in an attempt to refloat her. Engines were reversed. Men shifted weight, rocked the boat, tried anything. But it was all in vain. S-36 was wedged fast and wouldn't budge. Every hour, the situation worsened. More flooding, more chlorine gas, and the constant fear that Japanese forces might discover them. Lieutenant McKnight faced a heart-wrenching truth. His ship was lost, but the crew could still be saved. Realizing that S-36 was doomed, an uncoded SOS was sent out, despite the risk of interception. It was a cry for help that McKnight hoped friendly forces might hear in time. They did. Another U.S. submarine, USS Sargo, picked up the signal and passed it up the chain of command. Allied headquarters in Java received word that S-36 was in trouble and dispatched help. A PBY Catalina flying boat was sent to locate the stranded sub and lend assistance if possible. When the plane arrived overhead on January 21st, the crew of S-36 waved from the reef. The pilot reported the crew was still working to refloat their boat and not yet ready to abandon her. The Catalina flew on to Makassar to coordinate rescue efforts with the Dutch. Later that morning, the Dutch launch, Atla, arrived. By now, S-36's bow was hopelessly flooded, and the submarine had begun to list. McKnight ordered the majority of his crew to evacuate. One by one, 28 enlisted men and 2 junior officers transferred to Atla. McKnight and a handful of key personnel stayed behind, making a final attempt to save their ship. They refused to leave just yet, hoping the next high tide or the arrival of a larger vessel might free the submarine. That afternoon, the Dutch cargo ship SS Submarine arrived on scene, but by that point it was clear S-36 would never ride the waves again. Reluctantly, McKnight gave the order to scuttle the boat to prevent her capture. At about 1:30 p.m. on January 21, 1942, USS S-36 slipped off the reef as seawater filled her compartments and sank beneath the surf. The last men of the crew transferred to Submarine, which would reunite them with their shipmates. Thanks to Dutch assistance, all 33 crew members from S-36 escaped the reef. That fact alone made the incident extraordinary, given the stakes and the fate that would befall so many other submarines in the months and years to come. The rescued crew was taken first to Makassar, then onward to Surabaya, arriving in Java on January 25, 1942. In those weeks, the war continued to worsen, and by late February, Japanese forces were closing in. After the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, the remaining Allied naval units were forced to retreat. Most of S-36's crew went on to serve aboard other ships and submarines as the war raged on. Lieutenant McKnight was assigned to a newer fleet submarine, USS Porpoise, which he would command later in 1942. S-36's story, though less well known than those of later wartime submarines, remains a powerful chapter in the history of the Silent Service. Officially credited with 1 war patrol and 1 enemy ship sunk, her combat record was brief, but meaningful. She received 1 battle star for her service in World War II. The courage and quick thinking her crew displayed in January 1942 became a testament to the value of training, discipline, and resolve. Their survival against the odds highlighted the perilous work of the Asiatic Fleet's aging S-boats, which engaged the enemy despite being materially outmatched. In the post-war years, as the U.S. Navy and veteran groups sought to commemorate the sacrifices of submariners, S-36 was not forgotten. A black granite monument stands on the grounds of the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, honoring S-36 as part of a national effort to memorialize each of the 52 American submarines lost in the war. The plaque notes that S-36 was lost on her second patrol, January 20, 1942, in Makassar Strait, Indonesia, and is dedicated in memory of all submarines and crews on eternal patrol. More than 80 years have passed since USS S-36 made her final stand. Today, little remains of the submarine itself. The coral and sea long ago reclaimed her wreck, and any remnants were likely salvaged or lost in the wartime chaos that followed. But her story lives on,